I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest news from across Ukraine as Russian forces advance on Pokrovsk. We analyse what Biden's decision to drop out of the presidential race may mean for US foreign policy on Ukraine. And we look into Russian spy hunting in Germany.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 22nd of July, 2 years and 154 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls, senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant, and Berlin correspondent James Rothwell. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hi, David. Hi, team. Let's start on the ground in the east of Ukraine. Russian troops said to be continuing their push toward the town of Pokrovsk, that's in the Donetsk Oblast, despite very heavy losses that we've been reporting on for months now. This comes from Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief, General Alexander Syrsky, speaking earlier today. Now, Russia, as we've been reporting, been carrying out very, very intense attacks across multiple sections of the Eastern Front since February at least. Huge cost in dead and wounded. Probably in the analysis today of Phillips O'Brien, Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews, somebody I recommend we all follow. He's suggesting that what Russia's doing is that they're accepting, well, we know they're accepting the casualty rate, but they're trying to grab as much land as they can, particularly in the Donbas region, before any possible Trump presidency seeks to freeze the front lines and then go through some sort of sham negotiation. So Phillips O'Brien saying that they're just grabbing what they can while they can and they don't care about the cost. Now, General Syrsky said fierce fighting continues in an area. Basically, he's describing an arc. I won't try and pronounce all the village names because I'll just embarrass myself. But essentially, Donetsk city, go 10 k's west of there and then take an arc from west through northwest to the north. That is the area where the most intense fighting is happening at the moment. Russian forces also said to be trying to seize the islands in the floodplain on the eastern bank, the left bank of the Dnipro River. Syrsky was talking about this as well this morning. In the area of Kherson Oblast, he said active hostilities of varying intensity are taking place along the entire front line. He said that in order to stop the continued Russian offensive, it's necessary to hit their main forces and reserves from a long distance, as well as to conduct complex attacks at close range. Now, we've seen Ukraine try and do some counter-attacking at close range, most obviously in the sort of Vovchansk area. I'll talk about that in a moment. But this idea he's reiterating, and it's not wrong, but he's reiterating what President Zelensky's saying about the necessity to hit Russian main forces and reserves from a long distance. This argument, the steady drumbeat, correct in my opinion, about being able to fire inside Russia to hit the forming up points and all the headquarters before they actually get into Ukraine. Now, Syrsky said this seems to be nothing new, as in the necessity to hit them at range. There seems to be nothing new. However, this requires skill in the use of weapons and equipment, accurate and manoeuvring fire, forces and means. That is high-quality training of all categories of military personnel to perform combat missions. I think that's probably the shape of things for the rest of 2024, because doing all of that, mastering your own whatever part of the armed forces you are in as an individual, that's one thing. Then knitting it all together is quite something else. To be able to produce those complex counterattacks at local, at short range, at tactical range, whilst also doing the long range fight as well. It's a big thing that's being asked of the Ukrainian armed forces there. Now, into the northeast, let's have a look at that sort of lodgement, the Russian lodgement around the Vovchansk incursion. Russia's thought to have deployed additional assault units in the area to prepare for further offensive operations. This comes from Nazar Voloshin, the spokesperson of the Krytsia group of forces. He was speaking to Interfax Ukraine yesterday. He said assault groups of the 155th Separate Marine Brigade of the Russian Pacific Fleet and the 18th Motor Rifle Division of the 11th Army Corps are massing in the area. Now, Russia, you'll remember, launched this push over the border in Kharkiv Oblast on May the 10th. That assault quickly stalled, didn't really go anywhere. and has been steadily pushed back since, in particular in the last month. President Zelensky said that around 20,000 Russian troops have been killed during that failed push, and that attack is largely defeated. As I say, now defeat doesn't mean total destruction. Defeat means that it can no longer do what it should do for the size of force that's been committed. So it still could be incredibly destructive and violent, but in and of itself, at the moment, it has failed in its task, and hence the military term defeat. There's a different doctrinal term between defeat and destroy, which we might go into at some point. But defeat doesn't mean that you've got rid of absolutely every part of the enemy. Now, Voloshin also added that Russian troops have been using drones for remote mining of the area. And he said that in the central and eastern parts of the town of Vovchansk, Russian troops are continuing to try to regroup to push forward, although they are being squeezed, particularly squeezed in the Vovchansk area. Now, the Ukrainian military said they'd also observed additional Russian personnel from the 41st Motorised Rifle Regiment of the 72nd Motorised Rifle Division deployed forward in Belgorod Oblast, so over the border in Russia. They've been brought forward near the village of Miron in Belgorod Oblast. This is only a couple of k's from the border, in particular near the Vovchansk area, that thought that they're the next ones to be thrown in and producing a nice target, I'm sure, in Belgorod right now. Now, inside Russia, and over the weekend, an oil refinery in the Russian town of Tuapse on the Black Sea coast, so about 150 k's southeast of the Kerch Bridge, has exploded, caught fire after a reported 75 drones targeted multiple Russian regions last night. This comes mostly out of local authorities in Russia. The strike against the refinery is said to have been conducted by Ukraine's military intelligence service. This is a source in the agency said to be speaking to the Kyiv Independent. Russian telegram channels said the attack also started a fire near the Morozovsk air base in Rostov Oblast, so about 100 k's due east of the Ukrainian border. So what is currently occupied Ukraine in the east, the furthest eastern point, go another 100 k's, and that's where the air base is. Now, the Russian Defence Ministry said that its forces had intercepted 8 drones over Krasnodar, 47 drones over Rostov, and 1 each over Belgorod, Voronezh and Smolensk Oblasts, as well as another 17 over the Black Sea and Azov Seas. We can't confirm any of that. Local authorities in Russia, they either said everything was fine, everything was shot down, causing no damage or casualties, or occasionally they might say falling debris from drones had started small fires. Now, we can't verify any of that, but for my money, I don't believe a word they're saying. And there's footage allegedly showing the drone targeting the Tuapse refinery, and that hasn't been hit and come down on account of any air defence activity. The two that I've seen on social media, they look like Bayraktars actually, TB2, but whatever they are, they were not intercepted on their way to the target. Now, Russian telegram channels, quoting Tuapse locals, said that there were 2 series of loud explosions this morning, and a channel called The Shot shared footage of what appears to be one drone attacking with a large plume of smoke arising when it landed. That's probably the thing I've been looking at online. Just for background, Rosneft's Tuapse refinery has been repeatedly targeted by Ukrainian strikes over the last few months. Following an earlier strike, the facility had to go into emergency shutdown. That was back in May. And the Astra channel on Telegram also claimed that drones targeted the Morozov air base. Rostov Oblast Governor Vasily Golubev alleged that here's the explanation, only dry vegetation caught fire as a result of the fallen debris, which was quickly extinguished. However, that airbase has been hit many, many times before. In April, it was thought that 6 Russian fighters there had been destroyed or sufficiently damaged that they're out of action in a Ukrainian drone attack. So I'm not putting my money on burning foliage at the moment, David. But I will take a little pause there.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for talking us through all the military updates. A few more updates from you, if that's okay, Dom, just on some other stories that we should cover before we go to Roland to talk us through the news from America. So, Dom Nicholls, can I stay with you?
Okay. Let's have a look at gas reserves. And thanks to our colleagues and friends at the Kyiv Independent for much of this copy. They're saying Naftogaz, which is Ukraine's state-owned oil and gas company, has accumulated 10 billion, big B billion cubic metres of gas reserves for next winter. They're speaking earlier on this morning, saying that represents almost 76% of the projected target of just over 13 billion cubic metres, which they were told to accumulate by November this year. Now, that figure, 13.2 to be precise, billion cubic metres, That goes beyond the expected consumption requirements and represents what they're calling a safety cushion for the next few months. This comes from the company's spokesperson, Vladislava Smolenska, speaking to Kyiv Independent. And they say that the last heating season, Ukraine used 6.7 billion cubic meters of gas. So, 13.2 is a pretty decent safety cushion. Now, Naftogaz chief exec Alexei Chernyshov, speaking in March, said that Ukraine had got through last winter using only its gas reserves for the first time in its history. However, we know that there's been a very concerted Russian effort against the energy infrastructure since then. Naftogaz Group companies increased their gas production by 8% over the first 6 months of this year compared to the same period last year. But there has been, as I say, continued and very destructive action by Russia. So we're not sure where they are in terms of the overall ability compared to last year. But if they've got those reserves at the moment, they do seem to be very much on track to get what they said they needed for next winter. OK, a couple more from me. A Ukrainian nationalist politician who opposed Russian-speaking soldiers being allowed to join the country's army was shot dead outside her home at the start of the weekend. Irina Fardion died on Friday evening in hospital in Lviv, just hours after being shot, single bullet shot from an alleged assassin as she left her apartment block. Police have launched a manhunt. The individual was said to have fled on foot. President Zelensky, we are told, has asked to be personally informed on the progress. Now, eyewitnesses said that an unknown man had been in the area watching Farion's apartment for the last couple of weeks, and broken security cameras fixed to the apartment block are said to be hampering the police investigation. I don't think there's any suggestion that was part of the attack. That's not the reading I've seen on it, but obviously none of it helps. Irina Farion, she was 60 years old, well known in Ukraine, a prominent linguistics professor, pushing a fairly hardline nationalist agenda, quite outspoken. And that investigation, as I say, is ongoing. And just a couple more from me. The British company Sheffield Forge Masters has said they're going to restart the production line for artillery barrels for Ukraine. This is an announcement from Britain's MOD. So Sheffield Forge Masters, they're planning to produce 105mm and 155mm barrels, the latter for AS-90 self-propelled artillery, that the big self-propelled guns that Britain has donated. But I think the mere fact that they are restarting production lines is interesting, is necessary and long overdue. Now, the Defence and Business Secretaries met President Zelensky and industry leaders in London last Thursday night. They all piled into Lancaster House. It's a very, very swanky old place next to St James's Palace in London, a place I only really go for the annual City Veterans Network dinner, which is very nice indeed, but I do sit on my hands during the auction because it's quite pricey. Anyway, President Zelensky met senior representatives from UK Export Finance, that's part of, it's arm's reach from the government, BAE Systems, Thales UK, MBDA, their missile manufacturer, KBR and Babcock. So hopefully more of this will be seen, more of this industry partnership and restarting old lines. Just why barrels, that's what the first thing they've gone for. Barrels are absolutely crucial, artillery barrels. They are, like any military part, they can easily be worn through. And if you fire the rounds on their maximum charge in order to get maximum range, then you just burn through these barrels very, very quickly. And we've seen that as they degrade, not only do they become less accurate because you're wearing down all the rifling and everything inside it, but also if you don't get that good seal between the missile and the charge behind it, the bomb basically, the round and the charge behind it, if you don't get a perfect seal, then you can have a catastrophic event, as we've seen with a lot of the North Korean artillery, the rounds that have been sent there. The tolerances, if the industrial tolerances, the engineering isn't precise enough, then the gases don't go in one direction, pushing the shell out the front. It goes in every single direction, including bursting through the breech of the thing and killing the crew. So, it is important to replace these barrels long before you start losing your own people. I'll take another pause there, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. We'll come back to you later because I know you're attending a rather interesting conference on which you have notes. But let's go to Roland Oliphant, our senior foreign correspondent. Roland, the big news over the weekend was, of course, the fact that US President Joe Biden has dropped out of the presidential election in November. You've been covering it over the weekend. What can you tell us, and what does this mean for the war in Ukraine?
Yes, well, this has been building up for a while, actually. And in fact, I remember putting the Sunday paper to bed kind of Saturday evening and being asked by the duty editor, when's it going to happen then? When's it going to happen? And I said, probably Wednesday, because I was hoping to go on holiday then. But it's happened earlier. It was about 7 p.m. UK time yesterday, so about 2 o'clock East Coast time in the United States. Joe Biden put out a tweet, which I may as well read out in full. Why not? If you haven't heard it yet. My fellow Democrats, I've decided not to accept the nomination, to focus all my energies on my duties as president for the remainder of my term. My very first decision, this is important this bit, my very first decision as the party nominee in 2020 was to pick Kamala Harris as my vice president, and it's been the best decision I've made. Today I want to offer my full support and endorsement for Kamala to be the nominee for our party this year. Democrats, it's time to come together and beat Trump. Let's do this. So that's it. He's finally bowed out. He's bowed out after a huge amount of pressure and almost unseemly infighting from the Democrat establishment, who'd basically concluded that after that really, really difficult, frankly disastrous debate performance versus Donald Trump on June 27th, he just was not going to be able to beat Trump. He was too old. The American public had seen through this facade that really the Democrat establishment had been keeping up, saying that, look, he's fine, he's still cogent, he clearly wasn't. And so he's bowed to the inevitable. And there are two questions now. One question is Kamala Harris really going to be the candidate who takes over? And we'll get to that in a second. It seems like she is. The other question is, if she is, who will be her vice presidential running mate? The significance for the war is obvious and will not need to be restated for any regular listener of the podcast, but it's basically that the prospect of Donald Trump winning the US election in November is viewed, frankly, in Ukraine and across Europe amongst Ukraine's allies as probably quite a bad thing. Donald Trump has long talked about how he's going to solve the war within 24 hours. He's obviously, has always sounded sympathetic-ish to Vladimir Putin. He's questioned how much money America spends on NATO and so on and so forth. But I think the real recent development that's really begun to make people sit up and take notice and kind of accept that maybe a Trump presidency is more likely to be bad for Ukraine than okay, was his choice of vice presidential running mate. So he appointed J.D. Vance last week is his vice presidential pick. And J.D. Vance is someone who has, clearly said, I think quite literally, I don't really give a damn what happens to Ukraine. So the prospect of American support for Ukraine really drying up, the prospect of a Trump administration trying to push Kyiv into some kind of ceasefire, potentially against its wishes, with the threat of cutting off aid, seems like a serious one. So a lot turns, basically, on this election. So is this enough? Is Biden bowing out enough for the Democrats to win back momentum and to maybe edge it in November? That's the question. The big question now, of course, is Kamala Harris. So Joe Biden has endorsed her, obviously. However, there are questions about whether she is the best candidate as well. So we even have a report. We picked it up. It's from the American, what would you call Axios? It's a political news service. Lots of behind the scenes, very, very, very focused on kind of politics and stuff. Anyway, they've been speaking to sources who say that one reason Joe Biden delayed his decision stepping down so long is because not even he has full confidence in Kamala Harris. She was at one point polling, I think, worse than Joe Biden. I don't think that's true anymore. And her supporters have begun to say, look, there was a reason that she seemed like a formidable candidate back in 2020 when she put together her own short-lived bid for the Democratic nomination. She's a career lawyer. She should be able to put Donald Trump on the spot. She's younger than Donald Trump. She's got all these things going for her. But she's got this unfortunate habit of kind of making gaffes, whether she's speaking publicly, whether she's in interviews. She's definitely alienated people. She is a California liberal. There's no way around that in the world of the great American culture war. Joe Biden was attacked for getting into bed with California liberals. She is literally a California liberal. So the Republicans will have great fun with that. And they'll talk about how people like J.D. Vance, with his whole thing about how his Appalachian heritage, standing up for ordinary working Americans, these Californians don't get that. That, I think, will begin to shape the race in the coming months. The next big date, then, to focus on these big questions about the Democrats is the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, August 19 to 22. Now, that is where Kamala Harris will either be endorsed as the Democratic nominee, in which case you have to choose a vice presidential candidate, or possibly, and it's not impossible, but it seems unlikely, maybe she'll be challenged. Maybe there will be some kind of competition. Someone else might throw their hat in the ring. You need 1,886 delegates to win the nomination at the Democratic National Convention. Joe Biden had 3,905, and he's effectively, I'm not sure he can actually formally hand them over to Kamala Harris, but he's given her his blessing. So it'll be difficult to take her on, but there's definitely some debate in the Democratic camp about whether she's really the person to win that election in November. So things have changed dramatically in the United States. But in terms of for Ukraine, November remains, a really pivotal point, and it's something that Kyiv will be watching, but also Moscow is going to be watching with great interest.
Thank you very much, Roland. Before we go to James Rothwell in Berlin, Roland, do we know much, if anything, about Kamala Harris's positions on foreign affairs? And has she said much about Ukraine before, or has Biden really been leading this in the US?
Biden's really been leading it. I mean, the Democratic camp is fairly orthodox and fairly behind Mr. Biden on this. I think what would be interesting is if you were to get a nominee, or maybe a vice presidential nominee, who had been perhaps more outspoken than Mr. Biden. There's definitely people who've criticized the White House for the restraint that the Biden White House has applied in terms of weapons to Ukraine and things like that. We don't know at all even who she's going to pick as a running mate, or even if she's actually going to finally make it to the nomination. So it's a bit early to talk about how her foreign policy is going to pan out or what her views are. But on the whole, I think we could expect a fairly orthodox adherence to traditional America in the worldism, if we put it that way. Because really, in a way, if we talk about foreign policy, this election, the big question isn't about Ukraine, right? It's about American kind of isolationism versus a more traditional view of America's place in the world. That is the dividing line. Ukraine is just one part of that.
Well, thank you so much, Roland. We'll come back to you as well later. But let's go to Berlin and James Rothwell. James, tell us about the spy hunting that you've been looking at in Germany, and in particular about the Russia House.
Hello, everyone. Yes, there has been quite a bit of spy hunting going on in Germany, not just since the invasion of Ukraine, but over the last couple of days. The first story that we covered in the Sunday Telegraph relates to the Russian House. This is a pro-Russian cultural centre in Berlin, which is basically controlled by a Kremlin-linked Russian agency. That agency is under EU sanctions, and as a result, there's been a lot of concern in Germany about whether the Russian House itself might be a front for German espionage or German propaganda. And one of those who's particularly concerned is Roderick Kiesewetter, who's the CDU's crisis prevention spokesman, the CDU being the main opposition party in Germany. And he basically said in an interview with the Telegraph that it was probably time to close down the Russian House on the grounds that it was, at the very least, being a sort of propaganda centre, but might even be housing Kremlin agents on German soil. And his concern is that the current government, led by Chancellor Olaf Scholz, was turning a blind eye to that for fear of provoking Russia. And listeners of the podcast will know that this has been a long-running issue with Germany. It's been, while it's been a major financial supporter of Ukraine, and it has, of course, provided the Leopard tanks and the Patriot air defense systems, it's been very scared about escalation, about angering Russia, not just on the refusal to deliver to Ukraine the Taurus missiles, which are long-range and very powerful, but also in issues like this one, where there's a centre operating in the heart of Germany, in the capital, and there are concerns that it may be hosting Russian spies. Now, the Telegraph did visit, or I should say I visited this centre as part of the reporting process on this story. And what I found inside really was, it appeared on the face of it to be quite a standard kind of expat centre for Russians, basically. Deliberately apolitical selection of exhibits. There was an exhibition of a Russian photographer. There was a cafe where, of course, borscht was on the menu, but no mention that I could see of the Russian war. And that might be because the Russian House has actually gotten into trouble since the invasion for screening propaganda. It screened a film about the Holocaust in, I believe, 2022, which characterized Ukrainians as Nazis. And since then, I think it's really been trying to fly under the radar. But this interview that we've done with Mr. Kiesewetter, I think, shows that it's still an active concern in Germany, that the opposition fears that not enough is being done to stem the scale of Russian espionage activities in Germany. We know that Germany is considered a prime target for the Russians. The Telegraph also interviewed Stefan Kramer, the head of domestic intelligence in Thuringia state, quite recently, where he spoke to that concern. And based on the response that I got from the German government when I approached them for comment about this, there doesn't seem to be any plans to take action anytime soon. And my understanding is that one of the reasons the German government doesn't want to take action here, such as closing down the centre, is that it's concerned that would provoke an in-kind response from the Russians. And that could involve, for example, the Goethe Institute, a German cultural centre in Russia, being closed down as a form of retaliation. And of course, there's always in the background of Chancellor Scholz's mind fears over perhaps even nuclear retaliation, not over something like this perhaps, but the bigger picture. There's always been this fear that if Germany is seen by Russia to be overstepping the mark, that Russia may drastically respond. Now, of course, Western officials, NATO officials would say pretty much explicitly, I think, that that concern is unfounded. There's been lots of escalation in this war, a great deal of it by Russia, of course. It hasn't led to nuclear war, obviously. But the German government is very concerned about that. And listeners may often wonder, why does Germany seem so cautious, so reluctant to take action over this? And that is a concern that's being actively discussed in Germany. It's not a universal view in Germany that they should sit quietly because they're scared of the Russians. There are people like the CDU who are getting increasingly concerned that Germany is basically being too soft on Russia.
James, sorry to interrupt you. Just before we talk about your second story, when you went to the Russian house, did you have to introduce yourself? Did you say, look, we've got some questions about what you've been accused of? Or were you just there to take a look around? What was it like for you?
Well, we put the questions to the Russian house in writing and we did not get a response from them. And we still haven't had a response to them over the specific allegations that have been levelled against them. I should stress that the Russian house controversy has been going on for quite some time. There have been protests by Ukrainian groups and others outside the Russian house trying to get it shut down. So they've been dealing with these sort of accusations for quite some time. A reporting colleague of mine did do an interview with the Russian house some time ago, and in order to get their side of the story across, we included some of those quotes with the head of the centre basically saying that he had no idea why the controlling agency of the Russian house had been placed under EU sanctions. My experience of the place itself was that it was quite calm, quite quiet, and I got the impression that most of the people there are not Germans who are curious to learn more about Russian culture. It's a sort of oasis, if you like, of Russian culture in Germany, which has quite a large number of Russian expats. You've got the borscht on the menu, you've got a bookshop that's selling Russian language paperbacks, all the classics, not just Tolstoy, not just Dostoevsky, but interestingly, some Russian translations of Western literature. I was particularly taken by the fact that there were some American Marvel comics translated into Russian, some Batman comics, and of course Harry Potter, which, as you may remember, Vladimir Putin took quite a keen interest in, or rather he took a keen interest in the wider row over J.K. Rowling some time ago. And of course, it's in the middle of Berlin. It's on Friedrichstrasse. It's right at the heart of the German capital. It's near some souvenir shops. It's near some department stores. It's bang in the middle of the city centre. And yeah, I suppose that was my overall experience of going on a visit there.
That's fascinating. Thank you, James. Can you tell us, well, it's more spycraft, isn't it? Your second story. Talk us through it.
Yes, more spycraft. This story has come out of the German media, from Bild tabloid over here, which has clearly got some good sources, in the BND, the German equivalent of MI6, basically, their foreign intelligence agency. And the story is that the BND is grappling at the moment with shortage in staff, too many existent staff taking sick days, and budget cuts and shortfalls, which have led to, for example, German spies who work on the Russia desk being seconded to the South American drug cartel desk or the North Korean missile desk, stretching the capacity of the BND. And there's always been concerns about German security apparatus, and is it well funded enough, and has it got the people that it needs? But it's obviously a particularly urgent concern at the moment, because as listeners know, there's this ongoing hybrid warfare campaign going on in Europe at the moment. There was the alleged Russian assassination plot against the CEO of Rheinmetall, which was foiled after it was detected by American intelligence services, who then warned the Germans. We had the 2 German Russians who were arrested in Bavaria some months ago for allegedly plotting to sabotage US military sites down there. There was the incredibly suspicious fire at a factory owned by a German arms company in Berlin recently, which NATO intelligence suggests was actually a Russian sabotage attack too. That's the wider backdrop of this. And so it matters that the BND appears to be struggling to recruit the staff that it needs, because it's under perhaps unprecedented since the end of the Second World War threat. It's right back in the danger zone of the Cold War in terms of lots of Russian espionage activity going on. And clearly, Bild has published this story because there are evidently sources within the BND who are concerned about this state of affairs and want to, I suppose, raise a bit of awareness about the fact that it needs perhaps more support from the federal government. Now, the German government will argue that they've got this Zeitenwende, turning of the times, new foreign policy that was announced after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's trying to transform German security, defence and the army. But critics of that Zeitenwende policy will say it's basically too little, too late, that for decades Germany was too lax on security, that it didn't view Russia as a concrete threat. And even though now, at this quite late stage in the game, if you like, there is a lot of work underway in Germany to try and shore up these institutions like the BND and get them ready for, if not just another Cold War with Russia, which clearly we seem to be in now, but potentially a hot conflict with Russia, that's obviously a source of major concern to everyone.
Thank you so much for joining us, James. We'll come back to you for your final thoughts at the end of the episode. Dom, can I come to you? Tell us about this conference you are attending and what we should be taking from it.
Yeah, sure, David. So I've been dialing into the Land Warfare Conference. So last week was the Air and Space Power Conference, basically the annual RAF Love-In. And this week it's the term of the Army, so the Land Warfare Conference taking place today and tomorrow in London. It's only just started, really. It's on today and tomorrow, but it was opened up by Dr. Jack Watling from RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. He was talking about the future of land warfare, and I just jotted down a few quick thoughts for us to have a ponder over. He was saying, so the old days, it used to be that concentrating your combat power, your tanks and your infantry and all the rest of it, so concentrating your power would overmatch an enemy. That's what you need to do. There's no point going toe-to-toe on an even set of numbers. You need to overwhelm the enemy with superior numbers, force, all the rest of it. Jack was saying that actually, rather than the concentration of combat power now being the determinant of who comes off best in any engagement, actually concentration can be a disadvantage. And he pointed to the first couple of days of Ukraine's counteroffensive last year, and we saw those pictures of there was a British Challenger 2 tank knocked out. There were some Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, I think. And he says, Jack Watling says, the side that is forced to concentrate is the one that will be attrited fastest. So at your peril, concentrate your force. You need to disperse your force. So the question then becomes, well, how do you overmatch the enemy? How do you achieve a superiority in, if not numbers, but then actual combat power in a time and space of your choosing to do whatever it is you want to do? If the mere fact of concentrating yourself and pulling all your forces together in order to punch through some defences, for example, you're going to be whacked. And the point he's making is that drones now, not just drones, but the ubiquitous nature of battlefield surveillance. So you can't really move now without being seen. He says there's no such thing as dead ground anymore. You can't really hide, or you've got to go back to proper basic principles of camouflage and concealment, and movement will give you away. So this thought that artillery, for example, self-propelled artillery that would shoot and scoot, come into position, fire rounds and be off again within 3 minutes, because that's when you could expect counter-battery fire to be landing on your position. Well, that's still valid, but equally the scooting bit is now a danger in and of itself. So you moving on the battlefield, that's going to draw the eye or the electronic sensor or the radar. So the land battle space now is a very, very difficult place to be, just because everything is seen. And if the sensor-to-shooter link, the thing that can see you, is talking or electronically talking to something that can shoot at you, if that link is very, very swift, then you've got a problem. So Jack was also saying, he was talking about the future role of infantry, and he was throwing the idea out, is the future role of infantry, rather than to close with and destroy the enemy, but is the future role of infantry to fix the enemy, to stop the enemy doing what they want to do and moving where they want to go, holding them in a concentration, if you like, for them to be hit by your side by beyond line of sight fires. So, have the enemy holding a position, holding enemy troops in so they can't run away, and then you call in strikes from over the horizon or from other formations, other units, to actually kill them. So is that the future role? He was talking about how counter ISR being intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, well, mainly drones, but not exclusively drones, but stuff that can see you and stuff that can do something about it. ISR, very basic, really, that's basic explanation. But counter ISR is a priority because you just can't operate. You can't think that you are safe to operate because even if you can't hear a drone, the first-person view drones, they're low, relatively slow. You can hear them if you're not near an engine yourself, if you're not in a vehicle, for example. But you can't hear them if they're above 400 or 500 feet. So you've got to assume the whole time that you're being watched and that someone is planning to do something about it. So countering ISR is a massive priority. Having a bubble of security over you is a priority. Electronic warfare protection, so that if there are drones coming at your position, having spotted you, you can jam them. And then you've also got to have short-range air defence, so point air defence to actually shoot these things down. So all of which is putting greater emphasis on a much lower level. You're holding very forces like electronic warfare and short-range air defence that might have been held at a higher level, needs to come right down to the sort of company and platoon level in the future. Jack was talking about having electronic warfare down to at least company level to provide precision from this, or protection from precision capability. But if you think about it, there's a lot of companies out there, company being about 100 soldiers-ish, 3 or 4 companies in a battalion, 3 or 4 battalions in a brigade, 3 or 4 brigades in a division. Those are the rough military maths. But if you've got all these little individual electronic warfare bubbles of protection down at company level, the electromagnetic spectrum is going to get very congested and you're going to start jamming each other. And Jack said that in many exercises that the Brits have done out in the States with US forces, it's quite often there's what's called electronic fratricide, whereby you jam yourself. You've got so much energy, electromagnetic and radio energy sort of buzzing around that you're just jamming your own system. So that whole thing then becomes a problem, what's called battle space management. Who can have what frequency? Who can have what power settings? Who can operate when and where and all the rest of it? That is very, very difficult to manage these days. And his final point, well, no, not his final point, but the last one I made before I dashed over to chat to you, was he was saying, you've got the different echelons in a military system. So you've got like the troops on the front line, and you've got the brigade headquarters a few kilometres behind them, divisional headquarters a couple of Ks behind them, corps headquarters, army, and so on and so forth. So you've got the whole sort of hierarchy of military activity. And it used to be that you're down at the bottom level, you could only carry so much because an individual soldier can't carry everything, weapon, radio, first aid kit, bit of water maybe, not an awful lot else. So anything above and beyond that, you've got held at a higher level. And it used to be that when you got into a punch-up that was more than you could handle, or if you knew that you were going into a bigger fight than your organic assets could service, you'd seek help from higher formation. You'd ask for the artillery that's held in greater numbers and greater range at divisional level, for example, to support you in an attack, or you'd ask for ISR assets that held at division or corps or what have you. Jack's making the point that every echelon will now be in contact simultaneously because you can't hide. Everything can be seen. You should assume everything can be seen, and everything on the battlefield, let's say, extends to a few hundred kilometres. So we're not talking across continents, for example, down that everything can be seen down to a finite level. But on the battlefield of a few hundred kilometres, you could assume that everything can be seen if you don't do it properly. And therefore, you can no longer rely on higher formation, higher echelon coming in to help you out with greater fires because they are probably in contact themselves. So the whole thing just speaks of greater mass is required, greater industrial link-up, so you've got just more ammunition available, more reserves in more places at more times because you don't know where you're going to end up and what you're going to have to rely on. But also this idea that you just can't hide anymore on the battlefield means you have to assume that you're being observed or electronically observed all the time. So that means operating in the dark, as in turning your radios off, going silent, relying on drills between movements, relying on much more on I'm here today, I'm told to get there in 24 hours time. No radio contact or any kind of electronic emission between now and then. I've just got to get there, and my higher formation has to trust me that I will get there, because if I keep squawking every hour, right, I'm now at this checkpoint, you're going to be seen and people are going to plot where you're going and do something about it. So as the battlefield opens up, this transparent battlefield that we hear the phrase coming more and more in use, then it means the forces on the battlefield are going to have to be dispersed more, and they're going to have to be silent more and darker. They're going to have to mask themselves either through electronic warfare or just not being on the electromagnetic spectrum. So a huge number of problems there for modern militaries and loads of lessons coming out from the war in Ukraine. And I'll get back to it after this. We're expecting this afternoon Ukraine's new ambassador to Britain is going to be speaking for the first time this afternoon. He's being interviewed by our friend Dr. Jade McGlynn, and she's going to be speaking to the new ambassador here, a chap you may remember called General Valeri Zaluzny. So that should be interesting to hear his keynote speech in 3 or 4 hours' time, the first time he's spoken since taking over as ambassador, David.
Well, thank you so much, Dom, for all of that, and we'll come back to you, of course, for your final thoughts rather soon. Roland, can we come to you before we finish? Alexei Navalny was killed in February, and you've been reading a new book on his life and his work. Journalism is often what we sometimes describe it as the first draft of history. What did you learn, and what can we say now, looking back to February and over Navalny's life, as to what he did and why it was important?
So I was asked at very short notice to read John Sweeney's new book about Alexei Navalny. It's called Murder in the Gulag, and it has obviously been written very quickly because, of course, died in a Russian prison in February. So 5 months later, I'm reviewing it, and I think it's going to be in the bookshops shortly. So John Sweeney, who I'm sure most of our listeners must know him, but if you don't, ex-BBC Panorama, before that I think he was with The Observer. He's a big personality in journalism, and he spent a lot of the war in Kyiv, actually. I believe he says he was recovering in hospital in Britain, and he decided to write this book about Alexei Navalny, who he'd met and interviewed a number of times. And the first thing to say about it is page-turning, punchy, very readable. You won't find that much new if you've been following the Navalny story and you're familiar with it, because I think what he's done is he's taken the open source stuff that was already reported, stuff that was already in the public eye, most of it. Not entirely. I mean, he has gone and interviewed other people, but there's no exclusive interview with Yulia Navalny or the Inner Circle or anything like that. So it doesn't shift the general kind of perspective on Navalny, but he does a very good job of kind of retelling you the whole story. If I'll get to the basic hypothesis, I think the whole point, if you read this book, seems to be as a kind of apologia and a defense of Alexei Navalny. And its basic premise is this. Whether or not he gave the order, as far as John Sweeney is concerned, Vladimir Putin killed, murdered, whatever you want to call it, Alexei Navalny. Vladimir Putin is responsible. The reason he did that is because he was a genuine, credible threat, and that he was, despite his flaws, which Sweeney goes into, basically a good thing, basically an enemy of the regime and the ideology that has led to the invasion of Ukraine. And therefore, in a way, this book seems to be addressed to John Sweeney's Ukrainian friends, who he acknowledges mostly didn't have much time for Navalny. And anyone who's been to Ukraine, speaks to Ukrainians, knows that that's a fairly widespread view in Ukraine. Lots of people in Ukraine felt that he was a walking embodiment of this idea that Russian liberalism ends where the Ukraine question begins. And his notorious comments about Crimea in 2014, where he refused to say that he would hand it back if he had the power to do so. Things like that. He did eventually denounce the war after the full-scale invasion in very explicit terms. That kind of got drowned out. But that's the general premise of the book, is that, look, Navalny was basically on the right side. He was deeply opposed to Vladimir Putin for the right reasons, that he was fundamentally really should be seen as, I suppose, an ally on the same great fight as the Ukrainians. I'm not sure if it will convince many Ukrainians, but that's the premise. It's fairly difficult to disagree with the way he puts it. But that's the long and short of it, David.
No, that's fascinating. Thank you very much, Roland. It's just interesting, I think, because obviously we're a news programme, right, when we do some analysis. So to come back to talk about something that happened 6 months ago is interesting. And just to see the stories and the narratives being shaped and being constructed is very interesting. So we do appreciate your reading of this, I think.
I mean, the thing is, Sweeney begins his book saying this is it's not who done it, it's a how done it. So you think, okay, he's going to show us how Navalny died, and he doesn't actually in the end. In the end, he lays out several theories about what might have happened to Alexei Navalny in that prison colony. Was he murdered by Novichok, as you know, the Kremlin tried to kill him before using Novichok? Was he poisoned over a very long period and eventually just died? Was it a matter of he was simply run down and ill and just became sick very quickly and died? Or there's this other theory he puts out there, was it something called he talks about a KGB punch, and the idea is that you put someone out in the cold for a long time, and the blood retreats to the core of the body to preserve heat, And then if you punch someone very hard in the heart, they die straight away because a blood clot forms or something. I don't know. Anyway, he lays out all these theories and he very sensibly doesn't come down on one or another. The one he decides is most likely is that actually Vladimir Putin didn't literally give the order, that Nikolai Patrushev did it, the former head of the Security Council, and he did it because he'd been humiliated by Navalny. Whether or not that's true, it's all very speculative, like lots of criminology. It's about well-informed guesswork. So again, it doesn't actually cast that much light on what actually happened. We may learn that in future, in decades to come. But if you want a recap of it and to grasp the questions around it, it's worth a read.
Coming up, we hear James, Roland and Dom's final thoughts. But just before we go to them, a quick update from me. And it's just to say that the second episode of our Early Access for Subscribers podcast is released on Apple. This week, it's a podcast of our visit to a school in the Kiev region on the banks of the Dnipro River. Myself and producer Adelaide Pujman-Ponte spoke to pupils and teachers to hear about school life in the full-scale invasion. So, if you're a subscriber on Apple, do listen now, and if not, don't worry, we'll release the episode for everyone on Saturday the 3rd of August. Well, thank you so much, Roland. Let's go now to James Rothwell for your final thoughts, then we'll come back to Roland to finish today's episode. James Rothwell, would you like to go first?
Yes, thanks very much. I'll end with a thought on espionage. We've seen many plots, it seems, over the last few months, alleged Russian plots against German security infrastructure, factories that support the Ukrainian defense against the Russians, even CEOs, high-level private citizens who are involved in supporting Ukraine. The story about the BND not having enough staff and therefore perhaps not being well equipped enough to deal with the threat from Russia will be raising alarm bells because, of course, Germany is not just a key member of the EU, but also a key member of NATO. And in a world where we may have a new president of the United States who is perhaps less interested in NATO to some extent than his predecessor. We'll see what the results of the election are. There will be a big question over Germany being able to stand on its own 2 feet as a security partner, as a credible deterrent against the Russians. This report in Bild's tabloid suggests that they're still not ready for that. And it does, as I said, raise concern about whether that will continue to be the case in the future.
Thank you so much, James. Roland, Oliphant, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I was talking about the import of events in America for Ukraine and the importance of Kamala Harris, as if she's going to be the nomination, her vice presidential pick. If we look at her record on Ukraine, it's very much within the Biden camp. Orthodoxy, she's met Zelensky many times. She said if she'll be president, then Ukraine can expect continued US support. But, you know, there's always been this slight debate about whether the Biden White House really gets it, about whether it's been too cautious. And I think that is where the question of the vice presidential pick, the running mate pick, really kicks in. Just as Donald Trump picking J.D. Vance kind of sends a signal about what his administration's attitude might be towards Ukraine. There are certain people, I mean, if you talk about, take Senator Scott Kelly, right, from Texas. His name is being kicked around as a potential VP candidate. Former astronaut, you may know him from his Twitter videos from the International Space Station. Anyway, he's someone who's been on Twitter very openly saying that backing Ukrainian calls to be allowed to fire weapons into Russia, for example. So there are people out there in a Democrat camp who might signal actually not just a continuation, but a slight change of course on the current Biden administration's position on Ukraine. So keep your eyes peeled on that for any kind of signals about what that might mean for those policies.
Thank you so much, James and Roland. Dom, before you head off on a much-deserved holiday, what are your final thoughts?
Thanks, David, and thank you also for letting me go on holiday. I should say that to my overlord and master. Thank you. Final thought, Amlan, thank you so much for writing in. Amlan says, the Battle Lines pod keeps talking about a defence review happening in the UK. You keep mentioning it, as in me, I keep mentioning it. As a taxpayer, I struggle to understand why will it take so long and what is the point of it wrapping up next year? Wouldn't that be too late for Ukraine and for the UK? Amlan, thanks so much for getting in touch. Yeah, I mean, I've a lot of chat about this, the new Strategic Defence Review. The new government here in the UK has come in. One of the first things it's done is announced a defence review. A lot of people are saying, well, don't we know what the problem is? Why have you got to go through all this again? We know what that we need the military to do. Well, it's not the case that everything has stopped. Business as usual carries on for the military. We've seen a number of initiatives, number of announcements, not least, earlier on this podcast, I said how the industrial side of things is moving on with that meeting in Lancaster House last Thursday. And also, I know that Angela Eagle, who's the Defence Procurement Minister, she has got stuck into trying to sort out the military housing problem, which is really bad. The state of military housing here, because a lot of it was contracted out to try and save money and what have you, just didn't really work. People are living in appalling conditions in some instances. So Angela Eagle has got stuck into that. So stuff is happening, both business as usual, as I say, and some new initiatives. But above and beyond that, the defence budget at the moment for this year is just over £54 billion, and that's going to rise next financial year to £57 billion. This is big lumps of money, and I think it would be irresponsible not to run a wet finger over the sums. You've got to get it right if you're messing around with that amount of public money. And I don't think we can blame the incoming Labour government, who've not been in power for 14 years, to want to do its own scrub. Now, whether or not it's going to take too long, they've said it will report in the first half of next year, which it could be almost 12 months. So yes, is that a wasted 12 months? But if you're spending this kind of money and there's a lot of big problems at the moment, maybe that's the amount of time it needs. There are some big questions. For example, GCAP, the Global Combat Air Programme, which is the next generation jet fighter after kind of F-35, Typhoon, F-22, that sort of era, supposed to be flying in the next decade. But a lot of money's gone into GCAP at the moment. It's the Brits, the Italians and the Japanese. I think the Swedes are in the sort of lurking in the shadows, maybe about to join the programme. Big talk about, is the Franco-German thing going to get involved? Is the US going to get involved? What this would do for European defence sovereignty, being able to buy its own and build its own military capability, or do you just go and buy whatever Lockheed Martin come out with next from the US, which might not be the wrong answer, but it's worth a look. And there's talk of, oh no, GCAP that's not been committed to yet under the new government. Well, I think you should give them a bit of a pass on that. A huge project. It would be wrong to totally leap in before you had a look at it. Having said that, the days of super flying hover tanks is not there yet. So whatever takes over from current fighter, fifth generation fighters, is probably going to be a lump of metal, air-breathing metal in the sky, optionally manned. So more obviously, most usually having a pilot, but not always. It could be optionally manned, which means it could be converted to be a drone as well. But we're going to have, I keep asking incoming chiefs of the air staff, whenever I get to meet them, I said, has the last pilot been born yet? I feel very pleased with myself when I ask this really clever question. And of course, they're all bloody used to it by now, so I'm losing the cachet. But we're not quite at totally autonomous air systems yet. So we know there's going to be something new coming down the track, something GCAP-y-ish. But it does deserve to be looked at, and that needs a defence review to do it. Also, just another couple of points, if I may, Amlan. The last government was big in its defence and foreign policy sort of strategy, talking about this tilt to the Indo-Pacific. You might say, hanging off the coattails of the US, trying to get involved with China and so on and so forth, having delusions of global grandeur. I couldn't possibly comment. But something like AUKUS is a very good pillar in that. Well, there are two pillars in AUKUS. Never mind that, sorry, mixing my metaphors. But the tilt to the Indo-Pacific is huge for a middle-ranking power like Britain. And is it actually realistic? Now, I asked John Healey, the Defence Secretary, when he just came into power a couple of weeks ago, I asked him about it. I said, look, you just simply can't do it. We are not big enough to be able to be big in the Euro-Atlantic area and big this tilt to the Indo-Pacific. And he accepted that. There are a huge amount of things we can do to support our friends, allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific region. But it doesn't have to be hard military power all the time. You've got diplomacy as well as other economic power and foreign policy and so on and so forth. So I got the strong impression from John Healey that what he was describing as Labour's NATO first defence policy is going to concentrate on the Euro-Atlantic area, in which case, what are the implications for that? Because the military that's built at the moment under the previous government did have this tilt to the Indo-Pacific sort of running through the DNA. So it does take a bit of a defence review to have a look at all the implications that are involved in not having a tilt, maybe a soft lean or a slight collapse to the Indo-Pacific, who knows what it is. And John Healey and the Labour government, last point here, have also been very clear. They see the Ministry of Defence, like every government department, they've said they are all economic departments. They are all there to do what they can, where they can and how they can, different scales according to different departments, to be an economic department, to drive growth to drive industrial growth and drive the economy of the UK. So, for example, when I interviewed John Healey, probably 6 months ago now, and Shadow Defence Secretary, I was asking about the classic old canard of defence sovereignty, and for the same amount of money, would you rather buy your widget in the UK, where you may only get 2 of them because the cost of life over here is a bit more expensive than other places around the world? If you went to the yards in Italy, Poland, South Korea, you might get 3 widgets for the same amount of money. And he said, it would go for the UK primarily because you get the money going back into the British system, go back into the economy here to be spent by the workers and so on and so forth, and investment and all that kind of George. Now, you might disagree with that and say that's not giving the best value for money to the military. They would have 3 things if they were built in South Korea, 2 things if they were built in the UK. We were talking in the context of fleet solid support ships, but the theory runs across the whole of the defence sovereignty argument. But he was very, very clear that the Labour strategy would be to get the money back in the UK, to keep it in the UK. Now, as I say, you might disagree with that, but it was at least he took a policy position, which is something none of his predecessors had done when I pressed them on the subject, and is at least a policy you can throw stones at and ask questions of. But all that needs a defence review. So I think all in all, sorry, a long-winded answer, Alan, to your question, I don't think it's wrong to do a relatively quick defence review, given the scale of the problem, the amount of money available, and new thinking from a new government. But we shall see what they come up with. If it's more of the same, then that might be slightly disappointing. But yeah, they should report in the first half of next year.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.